The first thing I want to point out when comparing these three 56mm lenses is there is not a bad lens in the bunch. These are all excellent lenses. In most real world results in photographs and videos, you can't even tell the difference. And because of that, I think for most people, if you already own one of these lenses, then I wouldn't necessarily be looking at one of the other ones as an upgrade. There are a couple of limited situations where you might want to do that, and I will cover those a little bit later in the video. But I think for most people, if you have one of these lenses and you're reasonably satisfied with it, you would be better off to add a different focal length to your collection of lenses and give you a bit more versatility rather than going through the hassle of selling the old lens and buying a new one or having two 56mm lenses in your kit. Now, in full disclosure, I bought the Sigma with my own money. The Viltrox and the TTArtisans were sent out to me at no cost to myself. I will put some links in the description down below to the best prices I could find on all of the lenses, and sometimes I do get additional discounts from the manufacturers or discount codes, and anything I've got around that will be in the description down below. These are three 56mm lenses. This is an 84mm equivalent field of view, and this is a traditional lens for portrait photography, wedding photography, corporate headshots. It's also a well-known lens for food photography or product photography. Anytime that you want to put a subject in the middle of frame, isolate, blow out that background, isolate that subject, and really draw attention to the item, person, or whatever that's in your photo, that's what this lens does really well. And I think particularly for people that are just starting out, getting a blurry background portrait is both one of the easiest and most meaningful things they can do with a real camera that they can't necessarily do with a phone. So because of that, this is a super popular focal length. And I think particularly beginners get really, really good results with any of these lenses or this focal length. Now, to start with, just comparing the three lenses, the first thing that we need to talk about is the build quality. We've got three different price points here, and we've got three different levels of build quality. The Sigma lens is incredibly well built. It's like many of the other Sigma lenses, if you ever used or handled any of their lenses before. It's a combination of this plastic or heavy duty composite material that they make a lot of their lenses out of, which apparently has advantages in different weather conditions and changing hot and cold environments over metal. And it's a combination of that composite material and metal. It's extremely premium. You feel like you really got what you pay for when you pick up this lens. It's based on a metal lens mount, and I think it is clearly the nicest of the lot. The second nicest and also the second most expensive is the TTArtisans. The TTArtisans is around about a third of the price of the Sigma. I don't think it feels anywhere near like a third of the build quality. I think it's probably more like halfway to 3/4 of the way as far as the way it feels in the hand. It is mainly a metal body with a metal lens mount, and it's got a little plastic in the lens at different points at the front, but it still feels like a really premium lens. The Viltrox lens is the cheapest of the bunch. It's also probably the least quality feeling, I would say, but it doesn't feel like junk by any means, but it is an all plastic lens. And it reminds me a lot of a kit lens that you might get with your camera, or Sony or Canon often make a 50mm lens, which is their cheapest prime lens for $150 to $250 or something like that. This has a very, very similar feel to that. The other thing that's interesting about this lens is Viltrox seems to be making a line of ultra cheap lenses right now, and they appear to be using the exact same body. So I think it's a 20mm full frame lens, and it seems to be the exact same outer plastic, just with a different focal length printed on it. I think this is just one of the ways that Viltrox has been able to make this lens so cheap. Once again, it doesn't feel like junk, but it is an all plastic lens. Looking at the optical performance of the lenses, the first thing we're going to have a look at is Vignette, and the Vignette performance is very interesting comparing these three lenses. The first thing is the Sigma has reasonably heavy Vignette, which starts when it's wide open, and it never really quite goes away. The other two lenses, the Viltrox and the TTArtisans lens, they seem to have worse Vignette wide open, darkening that goes almost all the way to the center of frame. But as soon as you go to f2.8, that almost completely goes away. And by f4, it's pretty much gone. So you have much worse Vignette performance on the two cheaper lenses when they're open all the way up. But when you stop it down a little bit, they get much better than the Sigma. Cleaning up Vignette is not a big deal, and so we've got different performances there, but not in a way that I think is meaningful or I'd pick one over the other. Now, the distortion performance, this is where things get quite interesting. The Sigma actually has extremely strong pincushion distortion. And I was testing all three of these lenses on a Fuji camera, and the Fuji camera was correcting that crazy strong distortion for the Sigma lens. So looking at the back of screen, the image looks absolutely fine. But when you actually bring it into Lightroom or look at the raw file uncorrected, there is a crazy amount of distortion. Now, this may or may not matter to a lot of people, but when you do correct that in either editing or in camera, it does stretch the image and you do effectively lose a little bit of resolution because of the way it stretches the image. The other two actually have much better distortion performance than the Sigma, even though they are the cheaper lenses. The TTArtisan shows a little bit of barrel distortion, and the Viltrox shows a little bit of pincushion distortion. And really between those two, I think it is very, very similar. You just get a slightly different style of distortion, but the two cheaper lenses definitely outperform the Sigma as far as the distortion performance goes. Looking at chromatic aberration, all of these lenses were so similar. It was really hard to pick chromatic aberration. In real world results, I went through all kinds of photos and I really struggled to identify particularly purple fringing on in-focus areas. And later in the video, I've got some test charts and we've got some heavy magnifications, and you really don't see any chromatic aberration to speak of, or just not an amount that would really matter to me. When we look at the flare performance, this is a place that has been a huge problem for third-party lens manufacturers for years. And it is the one place that they have tailed so far behind Sigma, Tamron, Canon, the big manufacturers. And in all that time, I think TTArtisan's probably was one of the worst as far as their flare performance goes. Now I think of the third-party manufacturers, TTArtisan's with this latest lens is actually one of the better performers. And when we compare the three, the Sigma is still the best performer when it comes to flare. You just get a slight blooming around bright points of light in the scene. I actually think it looks really nice and soft, and I think the image is great, and it still maintains its contrast really well. Having a look at the TTArtisan's lens, I think it is the second best performer. It has that similar amount of blooming around the highlights, and then you get a little bit of rainbow flare in different parts of the frame, depending on where the light is coming from. I don't mind a bit of rainbow flare. I think it looks kind of cool. And you don't lose contrast in the image and get a completely washed out or desaturated image, which is quite important. Having a look at the Viltrox lens, in theory, it has the worst performance because it has more of those rainbow flares, and it has this rainbow light source, really sort of rainbow flares radiating from the light source in the frame. But I kind of like that. I actually don't mind that look. So while that is an optical flaw, and I think maybe you would say that was the worst one, I don't mind that look at all, and I don't have a problem with the flare performance on any of them. The Sigma's definitely the most clinical, and then the TTArtisan's, and then the Viltrox lens. Now, I did all of these flare performance tests without the lens hoods on, but an interesting thing, if you look at the different lens hoods, the Sigma comes with a nice deep lens hood, which would be common for a 56mm lens because it kind of sees out into the distance and it doesn't really see very wide. So you can have a nice deep hood. The TTArtisan's goes with this crushed can look hood, which I actually think is super cool. It's a great street photography look, and I think it still does a good job because it kind of tapers in and really shades that lens. The Viltrox lens has gone with this tulip shape design, which appears to be the exact same lens hood that they're using on their 20mm full frame. And once again, I think this is a cost savings thing, but you could definitely make a 56mm lens hood that was deeper. And if they did, it probably would improve the flare performance, or at least the real world results in flare when you're using this lens. Looking at the quality of the bokeh and background blur on these lenses, I actually think for a lens like this, the quality of that background blur and bokeh is more important than sharpness and detail. And that's because when you are taking a blurry background portrait of a person or a product or food, and you're trying to draw attention to that thing in the center of frame and just blow out that background, most of your photo or video is out of focus. I think the quality of that backdrop or background blur to the thing that's sharp and detailed and in focus in the frame is generally more important than sharpness, detail, and contrast. Looking at these three lenses, they all do a very good job of dealing with bokeh and background blur, but there are some subtle differences between the three. To start with, the Sigma is an f1.4 lens. That means the Sigma can give you a more blurry background because the aperture opens wider. And even though I think when I look at the quality of the background blur, I think the TTArtisans might be the best. Because the Sigma can blow that background out more, I think overall the rendering of the background blur is better out of the Sigma. Now, just having a look at these specular highlights in bokeh, the Sigma gives a nice even round specular highlight or bokeh ball. It does have some slight patterning in the center with a little bit of an outline, but I think they still look very, very good. And unless you're really zooming in on the bokeh, you're not going to notice that. I think the TTArtisans actually renders that out of focus area a little bit better, but the background is not as blown out. And because of that, by comparison, side by side, I prefer the look of what's coming out of the Sigma. But once again, in a lot of cases, the key to having a blurry background is just having a blurry enough background to draw the attention to the thing in the center frame. And all of these lenses are going to do that. Yes, you're going to be able to blow it out more with the Sigma, but you can certainly blow it out enough with the other two lenses that you're going to be able to draw attention to the thing in the center of frame. Looking at the Viltrox and its bokeh, it has a cut lemon shape through most of the frame. Now, this is considered not as good as a round bokeh ball, but I actually don't mind it. I think it gives it kind of a swirly effect, and I think this is really very much a personal preference type thing. Looking at general out of focus areas when you have some sort of foliage or some sort of busy background and which one is a little bit smoother than the others, I think the Sigma renders the smoothest out of focus area when you have some foliage or a busy background. I think the TTArtisans is second and the Viltrox is third. But once again, I think these results are also very, very close, that in real world results, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And even when I was putting them side by side and trying to pick which one I thought was better, I had to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. In addition to the Sigma giving you a more blurry background, there is one place that the Sigma does noticeably outperform the other two lenses, and that is when it comes to autofocus. The Sigma lens was virtually bulletproof with autofocus. It just did not seem to miss. I mean, I wouldn't say maybe it was a 100% hit rate, but it was probably 97% or something like that. I think the other two lenses were probably about 85% roughly. Slightly worse, still very good. If you had a subject in the scene that wasn't moving a lot, neither of the other two missed. If you had a person, you were doing a portrait, somebody's not running, a sport, nothing like that, they are not going to miss. But if you get a lot of movement, or if you're doing street photography and you throw the thing up really quick and you think the box is on the person and you press the shutter, there were times when the other two budget lenses did miss that shot, or there was a series of 3 shots where they missed one, where in those same situations, the Sigma got every single one. Now, there's one very important thing I should say about that. The Sigma has been around for a while and probably has had a number of firmware updates since release. The other two lenses are brand new, and I think they both are on version 2 or just one update from their original release firmware. What I do find, particularly with these third-party Chinese lens manufacturers, is they often release the lens and the autofocus isn't great, but it rapidly gets better with firmwares within the first few months. And as an example, the Viltrox, when I first took it out, was not good. And I reached out to Viltrox and I said, do you have a firmware update coming? Because I've seen this with their lenses before. And they said, yes, it'll be available early next week. I got it and installed it, and bang. Now all of a sudden it is good as the TTArtisans. They're very, very similar to each other. It's not impossible that we might see further firmware updates on both of those lenses, and they might get closer to the Sigma. But at the time of shooting this video, the Sigma is definitely getting a higher hit rate, and you're probably going to get 10 to 15% more in-focus photos or videos using the Sigma lens. Now, when it comes to sharpness, all of these lenses are sharp enough that in real-world results, if you're taking a picture of a person or a dog or a product or anything else like that, and you're shooting the lenses absolutely wide open, even when you zoom in, I think you will very much struggle to tell them apart. They are so very, very close. But I know people love to see these darn sharpness chart tests. I don't like to do them but I have, and here are the results. To start with, the Sigma goes to f1.4, where the other two lenses, the Viltrox goes to f1.7, and the TTArtisan's only goes to f1.8. At f1.4, the Sigma lens is extremely sharp, wide open. You can happily use it wide open in the center of frame and have no problems. To compare the three, we stop down to f1.8 because they can all shoot at f1.8. The Sigma and the TTArtisans are very close in the center of frame. I think the Sigma just edges out the TTArtisans, but I think in real world shots, there would be no noticeable difference and you wouldn't even be able to pick them apart. The Viltrox is slightly weaker wide open with just slightly lower contrast. But importantly, when I was shooting with the Viltrox lens, it's an f1.7 lens and wide open, it's at f1.7. When I try to stop the aperture down, it jumps from f1.7 to f2. I can't actually set the camera to f1.8. So the Viltrox shots were done at f1.7. It's possible that if I could get it to f1.8, the contrast might be similar to the TTArtisans and the Sigma when they are set to f1.8. So not exactly a fair comparison, but shooting them the way I did, the Viltrox was the weakest of the three. But stay tuned because there's something really interesting that happens with the Viltrox in a few seconds, and I've never seen it before. I've heard it happens, but I've never seen it before. Stopping down to f2.8, they're all very close. Sigma still has a slight edge, but it's really becomes extremely hard to tell them apart at this point. And at f4, I really can't tell any of them apart. There might be slight variations in the exposure you're seeing in the sample images that I shot on the charts on screen now, but I can tell you when I zoomed in and did all the close pixel peeping, I couldn't tell them apart. Now, looking at corner sharpness, this is not something that I worry about so much with lenses like this, but I know people are interested in corner sharpness and people cover it in these videos. So here's the corner sharpness. And the reason I don't worry about corner sharpness is because this sort of lens, I'm usually taking a portrait or somebody in the middle of frame. I'm not putting something at the very corner of frame that somebody is going to look at. So it's just not a thing. The Sigma edges out the TT, but the Sigma has a noticeable distortion, which is a very interesting thing and harks back to our distortion performance. The Viltrox is the best in both the contrast and detail. So wide open, shot at f1.7 on that lens and f1.8 on the other two lenses, all of a sudden the Viltrox goes from marginally the worst performance in the center frame to quite noticeably the best performance. And then that got me wondering, well, I wonder what the corner performance on the Viltrox looks like compared to the center performance on the Viltrox at f1.7. And it looks to me like the corners are actually a little bit sharper than the center of frame shot at f1.7. Even when I'm focused in the center of image. And I did see in one of Christopher Frost's videos, he said that in about 5% of the lenses that he tests, you focus on the center of frame and the corner is still sharper. So this seems to be one of those limited lenses that is the case. Now, if we stop them all down to f2.8, the Sigma remains a little bit sharper, I think, than the TTArtisans, but the Viltrox is the sharpest and noticeably so. Once we go to f4 and then on to f5.6, it's the same story. Viltrox is still the best, TTArtisans is the worst, and the Sigma is somewhere in the middle. The other thing that I think might be even more important than corner sharpness is edge sharpness. And starting at wide open, f1.7 on the Viltrox, f1.8 on the TTArtisans, and shooting at f1.8 on the Sigma, the edge of frame is the sharpest in the Viltrox. So we've got this really interesting performance where all around the center of frame, the Viltrox is the sharpest, but when we're in the center of frame, the other two lenses tend to be a little bit sharper, particularly wide open. Looking at close-up image quality, the Sigma has the closest minimum focus distance. It also renders the most sharpness and details in those shots. The TTArtisans is not too far behind. It just has a little bit more distance for the minimum focus distance, and the sharpness and detail is just slightly behind the Sigma, but still very good. The Viltrox has excellent close-up image quality, but the minimum focus distance is way behind the other two. So if you're looking for a lens for close-up detail shots and maximum magnification, then you want to be looking at either the Sigma lens or the TTArtisans lens. So if you've watched this whole video and you're still wondering what is the right lens for me, let's look at the Sigma first. The Sigma has the best build quality. It probably has the best optics overall. It goes to f1.4, which is going to give you a more blurry background and it's going to give you better low light performance. and it comes from a brand that you can know and trust and has been around a long time. It is around 2 to 3 times the price or more of the other lenses, but I think it is the best lens of the group. Now let's look at the TTArtisan's lens. This is kind of a middle ground. You're paying probably about 35 to 40% of the price of the Sigma lens. You're still getting an all metal lens. You're getting a lens that's very similar as far as the sharpness goes in the center of frame. It is an f1.8 lens, so the low light is not quite as good as the Sigma, and you're not going to get as blurry a background, but you've got a very, very good lens, and you sacrifice a little bit of autofocus performance. And then we look at the Viltrox lens. This is the budget king. It is the cheapest of all of them. It has the cheapest build quality, but optically it is still very, very close to the others. Maybe just wide open a touch behind in the center of frame, but does make up for that by being sharper in the corners and on the edge of frame. And by the time you stop it down a little bit, they all pretty much look the same. Maybe you could argue that the bokeh is a little bit better on the other lenses, but honestly, it is so close that I think unless you put them side by side, you would never know. So if you are on an extreme tight budget, then I think the Viltrox is your #1 choice. I recently published a video saying TTArtisan's is the new Sigma, and I've just thrown that video up on screen now. I think if you are a budget photo or video shooter, what is coming over the next 12 to 18 months is absolutely huge, and I talk about it all in that video.